Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Don Opitz, Interim Dean of the School for New Learning, and it's great to see you all and to see some familiar faces and to see some new faces. Hi, Nikki. Hi, everyone. So, first, just a warm welcome to you all for tonight's event hosted by the Center to Advance Education for Adults. One of the gems of the School for New Learning that has been with us for about 12 years or so. And as you all know, the School for New Learning has been around much longer. In what year was the school founded? 1972. So we are completing our 47th year, which is pretty exciting. As many of you know, we are going to be changing. We're becoming a new school with a new name, but the same mission and the same people that we are engaging in our mission. In other words, we're still going to be about adults, continuing education, professional education, lifelong learning, and exciting stuff like that. I say this for two reasons. One is, this is going to be the final year for many of our faculty who are retiring. And Catherine Marino, my dear colleague over here in the front row, is also amongst those faculty who are retiring. She has been, I know, and I hate to put you on the spot, but I must. Catherine has really been the lifeblood of the school and of the center for so many years. I won't say how many. I know it's been at least 35.
As he throws it out there.
And she's been, you know, as I said, a wonderful mentor and a close colleague of mine for the past 13 years. And I look forward to that continuing beyond retirement. So we look forward to keeping her engaged as we look into the future. A lot of people are asking, well, what does this mean for the center? This is her final year as director of the center. She succeeded another wonderful person that has been a part of our community for many, many years, Pamela Meyer, who's standing over here. I think so I did want to get us started before acknowledging the brains behind the center, and we will continue. It's it remains to be seen how we will continue, but we will still have gatherings, and we will still have a network, and we will still have you, hopefully, engaged in that future. I didn't mention the name of the new school. Who knows what that name is going to be?
I just remember it's long.
It's long, I know. It just rolls right off the tongue. The School of Continuing and Professional Studies, SCPS. It almost sounds like CPS. So anyway, we look forward to how that change is going to unfold in the coming months and in the coming year. Folks say, oh, I'm kind of nervous about this. And I realized this morning that I am not nervous. All right, I just contradicted myself. But one of the reasons why is because we have wonderful people that are remaining a part of this mission and this project as we move forward, and they've been a great, support and guide through this process. So I'm excited, and I look forward to what lies ahead. Before I pass the mic, I just want to give Catherine a gift. Catherine has been complaining of some back pain lately. So this should help. All right, so thank you. All right, so I'm going to introduce Pamela Meyer. She's our former director of the center and longtime director for at least 10 years. So I'm going to hand this over to Pamela. And again, welcome everyone.
Thank you, John. So So welcome everyone. We have been, actually I feel like in many ways we've been putting this panel together for years and years, and I was thinking about, you know that interview question they like to ask celebrities about, I've been talking to you, the interview question of if you could have anybody to dinner, who would it be? And this would be my dinner party, and so truly, and actually many of you in this room as well. So we're going to have such a fantastic conversation tonight. I mean, truly, if I thought about my first choice of people to have a conversation about what is happening in learning and in our rapidly changing environment, all of our different contexts, and I realized we have so many rock stars in the room, also in learning and development, that not only could anyone sitting here lead an entire evening on their own and could, but many of you in this room could as well. So we'll do a lot of listening and give and take and be sure we have a really robust conversation. And while I would love to have every single person introduce themselves to every single other person, that would be, you know, the entire evening. So instead of that, I wanted to first do one thing, which is to check out how many of you here work, partly for our panelists, but so each other knows, how many of you are working primarily in a business or corporate sector? Would you say most of your work is in kind of a for-profit sector? Okay, great. How many of you would say it's really more nonprofit or community-based organization? And some of you may raise your hand more than once, because you're working in more than one, okay. And how about higher ed folks? Do we have a few higher ed folks, mostly higher ed? Okay, nice. So this is exactly why the center was founded, because most often as learning professionals we talk to each other in our sectors, and we create these venues where we can have conversations and cross-pollinate and inspire and hear what's happening in other sectors, which is why we put this panel together of some of our rock stars from corporate, from nonprofit, from higher ed, and some across these sectors. So we'll be getting that conversation going with them in just a moment, and I'll be introducing them. We decided that because we understand that everybody here can read, that rather than reading their bios to you, you can read just the facts, high point bios, and these are the short bios. Everybody has like a page and a half bio because they have such experience, but I'll say a few personal words about each of them. But before I do, I want to give you an opportunity to start the conversation and respond to the question that the panelists will be answering in just a moment. But we've been asking them to think about this for a little while, and we're putting you on the spot. But we'd love for you to turn to someone next to you, or maybe you might have a conversation with 2 or 3 of you, and think about this question, because it's really what founded our panel tonight. What is changing in your practice setting? And how are these changes affecting your learners, your role as a learning, and your role as a learning professional? So of course there's no one right answer here, but we just want to get the conversation by thinking about that question together, and then we'll bring our panel in on it and see what we can stir up and what we can generate together. So again, turn to the person next to you, swivel back to find at least 1 or 2 other people you can have this conversation with, and I'd love to hear one person who feels like they could, in 60 seconds, capsulize what's changing in your sector if you felt like you had a really good conversation about what's happening in the business sector and the corporate sector, who could kind of share a snapshot version of a conversation that you had about what's changing, and anybody willing to try?
Well, one thing, so I'm in the kind of corporate sector, and one thing that's changing is we don't have time to coach anymore. So people are left alone to study, and then their success is based on the outcome of that self-study. And that is basically how they're measured in terms of performance. And so this is a big impact in terms of agility, learning, and the capacity that we expect people coming out of school and people who have been in the field to learn quickly and produce.
And so that's a perfect comment to start off. It's one of the reasons we thought this was such a hot topic, because we're asking more of learners in the workplace, expecting them to take more responsibility for getting up to speed, staying up to speed, and often not having as much either time or resources to support them. So that is putting a different relationship in the learning equation, and so that's a great opening comment. Do other people in business having similar, or any sectors, to whether it's time, resources, higher expectations and burden?
We were a group of three. We had a not-for-profit, I'm in education, and we had a corporate. There was only one me, and then the amount of information, the quantity we're expecting people to absorb was another issue, and then how to change for the times, focus more on soft skills and delivering that, and the more, when you do that, they all want more of that, and there's only back to one.
Excellent. And would you say, was that representative of all of your sectors, or would you say?
Yes.
So who might weigh in on, as a higher ed representative, someone who feels like there's a lot changing in higher ed that is shifting our relationship with our learners? Anybody feel like you can hold forth an insight or two there? Alexia?
Yeah, well, we kind of, have like different genres of work that we have, but we talked about the social media and time, and being able to, to get learners to make the adjustments and also become, I guess, involved in their learning process. But social media is always distorting or changing how they learn, and so we have to figure out ways in which we are able to use that as a strength, or kind of to flip the script so that it becomes a positive experience and not one that we continue to struggle.
That we're battling against. They're good, so we're seeing brain structuring and how people are learning, attention spans, all kinds of things. So rather than fighting against this, how can we harness this and
because when you're an adult or a student in high school, some of the social media has such a wide exposure in learning, and that it's even become a place that others have launched businesses to teach others about information and about different experiences. So
yeah, excellent, good, and how to be responsible, not just mindlessly scrolling. Yeah, Trish, can you speak to nonprofit, or just build on?
I was just going to say, and it ties into what it is that you all brought up, and that is, this is, I think, part of the reason of the soft skills, right, is everybody's trying to figure out coping mechanisms. We don't have coping mechanisms. We don't know how to deal with the modern workplace, modern school life, modern life, our social relationships, online, offline.
Yeah, good. So it's a general sense of overwhelm. Anyone feel like you had a really great couple of insights that are specific to nonprofit, or you might want to add in?
It's remarkable that the young lady in front of me talked about social media, because we did as well. I work with DePaul USA, which is a nonprofit organization that houses DePaul University students who become homeless. So one thing that we notice is we may not be able to capture them by a physical address, but everybody has a social media platform.
yes.
So that helps us kind of capture, that helps us capture people, because even if you're on the move, if you're couch surfing, mostly everybody now has a cell phone and has a smartphone. So we can definitely reach out, keep in contact that way through social media, follow up with people who we've had housed and no longer housed. So social media on our front has been a positive experience.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, these are great opening insights, and we'll keep tapping into throughout. We'll be shifting to give our panelists a chance to weigh in and share some of their experiences, but we will keep you in the conversation throughout, and if you feel like you have a burning thing you want to interject, but we'll be sure we've set aside time at the end to have a fuller conversation with all of you. So I do now want to, even though these short bios don't fully do everyone here justice, and I won't either fully, but I want to share just a little bit about why I chose these four wonderful people for my dinner party, and we invited all of you, and I'm sorry the dinner isn't better, but we could, a dinner less party. So actually, we'll start with Dr. Tiffany Dotson. Tiffany actually got our attention at the center some years ago when you found your way here, I think through Leo Scott, but from the moment Tiffany joined the conversation, she was one of the people that everybody's like, oh, she had something really interesting to say. Oh, that's an interesting idea. And then afterwards, we all walked out. So who was she again? Where did she work? Is she on our mailing list? Is she like, how did, so we've been tracking with Tiffany as she was, I think, finishing her doctorate at the time, but had a wonderful role at United and has moved on to leadership roles in major corporations around the country. But she is an innovator, someone who brings a wisdom and a commitment to learning and development that is both deeply personal and part of your life story, but also something that, in my experience of the little bit I've had a chance to collaborate with you directly, anytime from our little room over at the School for New Learning to Rockstar huge amphitheater at Liberty Mutual, everybody stops and listens and pays attention to Tiffany's ideas, and so you're always been a learning leader, and I'm excited to have you in this conversation and hear more about what you're doing and how you got to what you're doing today.
Thank you.
So, and I love that you sat in the order that I have your words about you, but Melissa, Lanier, Preston also not only got my attention, I think you found your way to me first, but we've had a chance to collaborate. I've gotten to collaborate with 3 out of the 4 people here, which is really how you get to know who's a learning leader and how they're a learning leader. But Melissa is Director of Leadership and Talent Development. It's in the file.
It's the easiest.
At T-Mobile, but the reason she is here is because from the moment we started collaborating, I got to understand this is a very different kind of learning and development professional. First of all, she was constantly in the innovative conversation, iterating with us. She talks about design thinking, but this is someone who, I do a lot of work in agility, and Melissa lives agility. And we were working on a project together, and we realized how soon she wanted it, how quickly she wanted us to be testing. It was like, really? Okay, we can do it. But you like stretched us in a way that was really invigorating and exciting, and we were learning together and exhausting ourselves and tearing our hair out and learning. And I mean, it was wonderful. And it's one of those things that you realize, and this is what she does every day, all day long. I just got a little bit of a taste of it. So. And to see that in huge multinational corporation and see someone taking risks and innovating and pushing the boundaries is really inspiring. So we sometimes think, oh, corporate learning, they're so hamstrung, or these are people who are doing exciting and innovative things regardless of the setting they're finding themselves in. So I'm so thrilled. And we have East Coast, West Coast. So we have Tiffany from Boston. Melissa flew in from Seattle. You flew in from probably Hyde Park, most recently from University of Chicago and Oak Park. But
Let me qualify. I'm from Chicago.
right, we have right.
This is my home.
We have good Chicago roots here, no question. So Sybil, Madison, we had a great opportunity. I think I found your way as I was poking around. We were trying to set up some micro learning credentials at SNL and badging, and you were already miles down the road with this when you were here at DePaul. And you'll learn more about the really cool stuff she's doing with Chicago Cities of Learning. And about one of the things that caught my attention about Sybil is that there was nothing that wasn't possible when we had a conversation. There was always like, oh yeah, you could do this. Oh yeah, we can do that. And we're so used to no when we're working in especially a higher ed institutional project. And so that was really cool. But then the other thing that I think you'll appreciate is not only was Sybil innovating in the project we were working on and teaching and doing a million things, but then I would go home and turn on the evening news, and it's like, is that Sybil on TV in the evening news? Well, she was on the police review board during the Laquan McDonald process, and an innovator there. She's now on the mayor's transition, for the transition committee for the new mayor. So I'm not sure if you are mayor yet or you're being mayor soon, but the things you'll learn about that Sybil's doing.
No, that's
One of the reasons also Sybil is here because she mostly works in the K through 12 space, but we realize that we often put these artificial boundaries between what's happening in K through 12 that's innovative, and but she's also working in all kinds of community spaces, and there's a lot we can be doing to cross-pollinate with what's happening in these different spaces. Plus, you're working with adults as you're interfacing in these places too. So anyway, that was a bit. But Pam Tate is the only person that I haven't directly worked with, but I've been in your learning ecosystem for decades, and everybody else I know has worked with you or for you. So in addition to being, and all of you, most of you I think know, Pam is a national leader in adult learning, a huge friend to us at School for New Learning, and really co-pioneer with many of the approaches that were at the center of our work. But the insight and your continued leadership and continued learning, we had lunch together today, and there were still more new ideas that were coming. We're thrilled to have you in the conversation to continue to lead us and provide insight into what you're doing. So big, long, additional personal introductions, but this is why we're convening this dinner party. And, so I want to give you a chance now to respond to this question, and we thought, because we have on purpose nonprofit, higher ed, and corporate, whoever would like to start, and then we'll kind of go back and forth between each of these people who are primarily working in each of these ways. Does anyone feel like you want to take the lead and start our conversation off responding to what's changing and how is it affecting your learners? And then we'll take it from there.
You can just call on us.
Call on us?
Just call on us. Like
oh, this could be the talking stick. We'll pass it on. Tiffany, would you like to start?
She's going to call it.
Yeah, so we're looking at this is a way for further introduction, but just 3 to 5 minutes each to give us a little bit of a thumbnail, and then we'll keep circling into some deeper conversation here.
So the question is, what's changing in my practice and how is it affecting my learners? So I think about, I work for a company, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, right? Yeah. We can all do Liberty, right? Excellent. So what's happening, my company has been around for over 100 years and has done pretty well. And you think about an insurance company, very fixed sort of mindsets, actuaries, very exacting. They are in service to mitigate risk. So all the disruption happening in the world around how clients want to connect with us through technology, having younger workers in the workforce, around how they want to be led. You think about traditional, very business-like command and control. All of these kinds of things that made the organization very successful is now being disrupted. And so you think about that. So we're having to think about how do we help our learners be more agile, meaning how do they actually work well and work with information and make progress with imperfect information when they have been very successful and rewarded for being very exacting and knowing the exact outcomes. But they don't have time to do all these analyses anymore. They've got to be quick, first to market. They also have to be more innovative, and that requires some test and fail, iteration. We're not used to that. So this whole notion around agile thinking and be curious and experimenting is what we're faced with and affecting the way our learners in the organization are seeing themselves in relationship to their success.
Ah, nice. So either Pam or Sybil want to mix it up with either nonprofit higher ed focus?
Pamela, when you opened up and asked people to kind of situate themselves in corporate, nonprofit, higher ed, it made me think about, oh wow, I'm sitting in higher ed, but I'm also sitting in nonprofit.
And you've done corporate work?
Well, some, a little, not so much corporate, but yeah, so I thought about a couple of things, and I'll just start with the K-12 space, where very interestingly, and I'm going to situate this conversation right here in Chicago, we are facing the need to educate our learners differently, aware that many times people remark about we don't know what the jobs are going to be that our young people are going to take on in the next decade. So very aware of the need to think very differently about how we educate our young people and what that learning process looks like. while at the same time really living in a high-stakes testing environment, which works kind of in an opposing way to that. So when you think about large-scale reform, the kind of system-wide, district-wide reform that we're contemplating in Chicago, I think we run up against putting models in at scale that can really engage our learners in the kind of processes that are going to result in the agility that you're talking about. So that's one thing that is concerning, and we have some opportunities to think differently about that, but that's a setting issue. I fast forward a little bit because I mostly teach graduate students, but for the first time I taught undergraduates this year at Northwestern. And I think I saw some of the maybe unintended consequences of that, of young people, maybe their parents on the race to nowhere, getting them in the best schools, and in some cases being set up to look for the right answer, set up to do well on a test, set up to kind of meet standards that don't really fit the environment that they're going to need to be in when they come out of school. So it was really interesting to see maybe some of the effects of what we're doing in the public education system, in particular in K-12, and be working with young people who are afraid of failure, young people who are afraid of feedback because they always were the best or they needed to be the best. So again, a little bit of counter purpose happening here as we're knowing that what the future looks like for our young people, but then on the ground maybe creating some environments where the learning that we really need, the outcome, and the processes that we want to see aren't happening at scale in the way that we would like to see. And then finally, I'll just say, kind of in the nonprofit space, I work with a lot of folks in community-based organizations who then work with our young people in these informal spaces where a lot of this kind of learning is happening between them and their learners outside of the formal walls of school, and have been involved in some work that really is about peers pushing each other. So really that learning kind of surfacing because we're in collaborative communities of practice where people are pushing each other to innovate, and maybe triggering kind of self-directed learning that can be really robust and deep, but then doesn't really have, as we talk about credentials, or not having formal ways to capture what that learning looks like, even though they're feeling very innovative in their practices and feeling like they're making shifts as learners and professionals.
Great. Thank you, Sybil. Well, I definitely want to come back to that because we've been talking about micro-credentialing and what that looks like. So, Melissa, back to our corporate setting and business setting.
Yeah, so I have been at T-Mobile since 2015, but I think to understand what's really happening at T-Mobile, you have to go back even before that. So I know many of you have seen a T-Mobile store, a T-Mobile commercial, right? The magenta is everywhere. You should see our headquarters in Bellevue, Washington. When John Ledger, who was our current CEO, started end of 2012, I believe, he came into an organization that really had suffered at the tail end of a failed merger with AT&T. So we were supposed to be acquired by AT&T. It did not go through. In the 18 months or 2 years of waiting to see if that happened, much of the development apparatus and investment just went by the wayside. And among other things in HR, right? It was a bare bones operation. When the tide turned, they started to reinvest. And like I said, in about 2015, I was hired. And the HR transformation was well underway. And one of the things that the folks in the organization were coping with was what you see on the slide back there. These are the Un-carrier moves. You would know these as television commercials, probably. Like, no more contracts and Global One. These were super exciting, very customer-focused things that happened with what sounds like the exact opposite of the way that my colleagues' organization worked, right? The leadership that came into T-Mobile moved very fast. Changes were driven in a sort of top-down, very directive way to make sure that we could get things out to customers quickly. And this started to work. It started to work really, really well. And people were excited, definitely excited, but also tired. And Pamela said, I found her, it's true, about probably 4 or 5 months into my tenure at T-Mobile, we were thinking about what we needed to do from a leadership development perspective for all of our managers. And they had this competency training queued up from a competency model from back in 2012. No one really thought these were the right topics, but we were unsure what should replace it. And so as part of this dialogue and the assessment, we said, you know what we really need? We need to help people feel that they can not only survive, but thrive in this world of constant change. We call it hashtag we won't stop because everything at T-Mobile has a hashtag. And so 13 books on agility later, I found Pamela's book. And so one of the things that we did really early out of the gate was focus on how to make our organization and our people leaders particularly more agile. We talk about not knowing what's coming next. I think that's completely true, particularly in an organization that's really trying to expand their service offerings. We launched a bank 2 weeks ago. Like literally, you can get a debit card, a bank. So you just don't know what's around the corner with T-Mobile. So we are working on our new leadership framework. It includes things like innovation, agility, and growth mindset because we are hoping to continue this dialogue of learning how to learn. The other thing that I think is happening for us is that success has been wonderful, but we're in a growth mode, and so across the organization, we have to continue to develop folks. And we are, in many cases, the customers of the folks who are coming out of our local school systems, right? And so I can talk a little bit more about that later, like the ways that we are thinking about building skills in our front line from a leadership perspective so that they can go on to grow really substantial careers at T-Mobile. People, as I don't have to tell you all, they don't come out of school ready to be successful even in entry-level job necessarily. So that's definitely a thing that's happening for us.
Excellent, thank you. Pam?
I was thinking about this question and how I relate to it, and I think I just need to say that throughout my career as the president and CEO of CAEL, which is the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, I've been concerned about how to help frontline, non-credentialed adults to get formal education, formal credentials, to essentially to remove the barriers to their learning and credentialing. So I have tended to work at the organizational level, at the system level. I have not been a direct learning professional in a classroom or in a training setting. So when I think about this question, what I went back to, because I've become very interested in the effect of automation and artificial intelligence on the workplace. So what I went back to was the very early work that CAEL did in the telecommunications industry, and I'll tell you why I mention that. Because in the 1980s and 90s, the telecommunications industry was being drastically disrupted. And workers in that industry who had been very highly paid technical workers were suddenly facing a completely new work and learning environment. And we, CAEL, were asked to come in and help those individuals return to learning in some form or other. And what we found is that that was not necessarily seen as a positive. People felt threatened that they had to return to a learning environment or a training environment. And so I think that because the world of automation affected the telecommunications industry in some ways earlier than it did in other industries, I started seeing way back then how automation was affecting people's feeling about their ability to handle the world of work that they had today and that they would have tomorrow. And so I got interested in this way back and have remained extremely interested in the effect of automation and changing work processes and now artificial intelligence on learners in the workplace. And I think the thing that has really become clear to me, and everything you read tells you this. I'm sure you see all the articles, that in the next 10 years, a significant proportion of the jobs that will be done on the front line in workplaces will be automated, a significant proportion. And that many of the new jobs that will be created and are being created every day will not require physical strength, will not necessarily require that kind of effort that we thought of as essential for so long, but instead will require the things that our other panelists are talking about, which is intellectual dexterity, creativity, the willingness to enter into somewhat chaotic work environments with a lot of ambiguity and yet being able to manage in an environment with a great deal of uncertainty. And I think that in the world of AI, artificial intelligence, when one thinks about what do I need to learn to prepare for such a world, surprisingly, the skills are not as technical as we think. What they are is really what you think of as liberal learning skills. Their interpersonal communication, ability to translate, to interpret, to do system thinking, to do all the things that we know are so critical for success in the workplace today, but that will be even more important in a world where automation handles a significant proportion of routinized jobs. So that's kind of how I think about this question. It isn't so much a change for me in my own practice setting, that term practice setting, because I think I'm not a practitioner in that sense. But I definitely see the impact of the world of technical transformation affecting every worker, even those that right now don't feel that it is affecting them. It actually is, because AI processes are being embedded into every workplace. So that's kind of at least my initial thinking about it.
And I'm wondering, and this is to start to get the conversation going amongst you, based on all of the things that you're describing, an increasingly dynamic work setting, interesting gaps between especially entry-level people coming into the workplace and how do we prepare them, but also I know both Tiffany and Melissa are involved in leadership development, moving people into the next level. What are some of the things that you're seeing or that you're doing and experimenting with, and from any of you, that you think are addressing this change and maybe beginning to move us into this idea of sharing responsibility, both creating more learning responsible people, but starting to share that responsibility with the learners. Tiffany.
So I'll share it. So one of the things we know about VUCA, right, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is here. It is causing disruption. In some of the research that we're finding around the brain, we know our brains don't like uncertainty, correct? We all can agree to that. given that all this disruption is happening, I think from a leadership development perspective, we're having to understand more about the brain and how to actually put people in places that reduce threat. And so my organization, we are taking a good look at understanding the neuroscience of leadership and understanding what's happening in people's brain as they deal with all these different changes. Because what we've learned is that when you have a physical pain, the research is showing that the same sensor in the brain activates when you have a social threat. So you can imagine if you're experiencing constant change and volatility, it's creating threat. And when you're in threat state, all the research shows that our experience that we can't be productive, we can't be creative, right? We can't be innovative. And so from a leadership development perspective, we're actually training our managers around understanding more about the brain. We're helping them understand how to really shift into a growth mindset, understand their responsibility for creating more reward in folks' brain versus threat, and understanding how that actually activates in themselves and in others. My company, again, I said, has been built and very successfully on a more of a fixed mindset. And so how do we get people to adopt more of a growth mindset? If you don't know about growth mindset, Carol Dweck is sort of the mother of growth mindset. Look her up, interesting content there. But really help people shift from this idea of being exacting and proving themselves being bright to actually start to do more experiencing. Start to focus on improving versus proving. Again, folks in my company, leaders, they have been rewarded for being exacting, for proving, for doing exactly what's right. And we're shifting to saying that even though we are in a risk mitigation business, because of all this disruption, we've got to think differently about how to do these things better, more than one way to do these things. So we are pushing folks to be more agile, to start rewarding folks for experimenting with different ideas, having folks not get involved in coming up with the best idea, but a series of ideas. We're having people do marathon ideation sessions, getting them just to get out of their normal idea around, here's a problem, here's how we solve it, but actually focusing on not who can solve the problem, but who can ask the best questions about the problem. We're teaching folks how to ask questions to really activate, again, more of a reward in people, in our leaders. We also are, in terms of responsibility, we are working with having folks co-create their own development plans. So historically, you create a development plan, your boss, your manager looks at it, approves it, they go forward. We're now saying, no, you have to come to us, being responsible to drive your development. We'll co-own it, but you're going to drive it. Being very specific about what it means to drive your own development, create the space for you to do that in the environment, but have you create your development plan, come to your manager, and then you all decide if this is good for you. And really taking our hands off and saying, you're the driver now, you have my full permission and authority, move forward. So those are just some of the things. That's why I think the big idea for me is around growth mindset, learning more about the brain and how it actually, you have responsibility to activate more reward and threat in the brain. And then really connecting with folks around what matters to them so that we can remove some of the other threats in times of uncertainty.
Excellent. And if you're not familiar with it, Kathy Marino co-authored the book recently of Facilitating with the Adult Brain in Mind, which is specifically on this topic. So those of you this idea resonate with, it's a great resource guide for this. Tiffany, if you don't know about it.
I have it.
Oh, you have? Of course you do. All right. Yes.
No question.
Sybil.
from the audience.
Yes, Randall.
Yeah, I couldn't help myself. This one of the words that have not surfaced, which I think is so critical in this discussion.
Can you give Randall the mic, please?
Yes. Yeah.
One of the things that, word that has not surfaced, which I think is so critical, is the word resilience. In the case where you're having transformation and change and disruption, the ability for the individual, if you want to talk about it from a neurological standpoint, is more about the issue of capability to survive, and what survival is really a manifestation of the behavioral resilience and teaching resilience and coping capability, which is fundamental to that. Right?
Yeah. Thank you. Sybil.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect to couple of issues just from the K-12 perspective. And we too focus a lot on growth mindset. Carol Dweck has really blown up in the K-12 space, and so a lot of educators in that space are really trying to think about what that looks like.
Would you help us understand what growth mindset is?
Yes.
The nomenclature all the time, and I'm not so sure anybody really knows what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Growth
so
mindset, what is it?
right, and people can add on. I'll start, and people can add on. It's based on a long legacy of research. Carol Dweck has been doing this research for a long time about whether you have a fixed or growth mindset. So a lot of studies, a lot of them with young people actually, around their conceptualization of what it means to be smart. And a belief that being smart is either you're smart or you're not smart, versus a belief that with effort you will become smarter. And so a lot of studies show us that if you have that fixed mindset, you're less likely to take risks because the outcome is going to reflect on whether you're smart or not smart. If you have a growth mindset, you're willing to exert effort because you believe that effort is going to pay off. So the growth mindset creates that less threatening environment internally. And in the K-12 space, there's been a lot of work thinking about how do we create that less threatening environment in the classroom context so that we have students who are willing to take a risk and not be worried about their performance being indicative of their ability. Anybody want to add to that? So it's very exciting that this is an idea that's kind of taking off in the K-12 space. The other thing that we've been talking a lot about here that is also related in the K-12 space is really thinking about how to have trauma-informed practices and understanding that a lot of our young people have experienced trauma here in Chicago. I'm again locating this in Chicago, but this is in many places in the U.S., unfortunately. And trying to create environments that are responsive to that. And again, the work around the brain and kind of what our brain does when it's trying to cope with trauma and supporting our own selves to be resilient. How do we create more resilient spaces, learning environments that are responsive to young people and the experiences that they're bringing with them into that space? So I just, when you were talking, saw those connections. I also wanted to, when I opened the school in 2011, and we were able to develop our own approach to professional development and evaluation. And that's the other thing I'm kind of connected to, Tiffany, when you were talking. And one of the things that we did was created a framework where we had certain competencies that we felt were everybody needs to have these competencies. These are core, and we defined them and then created kind of a badge system around them to think about, to help people think about how do I level up in these core competencies, these competencies that everyone in this environment really needs to have. And in our environment, those core competencies revolved around creating a certain kind of classroom culture. This was a school that was organized around system thinking, so there were some core competencies around thinking about design thinking and system thinking. I think there was a third one. But then we also tried to extend that to say, here are a whole other set of competencies, and you can add to them, but here's a starting place. And we want you to choose when you're ready to go for those, right? And to pursue that on your own. And so we were really trying to have this combination of, we want to communicate to you kind of what are some baseline competencies that we think are important to being successful in this environment, but we also want to create a space where you as a professional and as a learning professional can pursue your own growth in specific areas. And so, and we badged it because we were a school that was really big on badging. But we wanted to create that kind of almost like an accordion, something that was expansive, that was open-ended and had enough structure and definition, but also open-ended enough that a teacher could take herself as far as she wanted to go with that. And then the way that we structured it is that those who chose to do that would then be able to present a portfolio that had evidence that they had collected over the course of the school year to a panel that was kind of like a combination of an inside people and outside people, as a way to say, here is kind of evidence of what I've been working on this year. And so that was one way that we tried to approach a more collaborative way to think about learning and growth.
And what I'm loving hearing, first a couple of threads that I'm sure you're all recognizing here, but that Melissa and Tiffany have both talked about iteration, and we've all been talking about growth mindset in some sense, but we certainly can't iterate with a fixed mindset. And so it is already approaching the idea that we're going to be testing and learning with each iteration, and whether it's a business or a nonprofit or even in higher ed, I think so much of traditional education is designed really in a non-iterative fixed mindset. We've got a curriculum that's fixed, we've got learning outcomes that are fixed, and so you're really suggesting some big things that are shifting in how we're approaching learning. And even, it's interesting, at lunch today, we were even poking a little bit at the competence-based framework, which of course we were huge innovators in School for New Learning, but we had a little bit of a robust conversation about various approaches to competence. I don't know if that's what you were about to weigh in on, Melissa, or if you want to take it a little further, either from what Sybil just said, or...
So many things we could talk about.
I know. Just getting started.
So I thought first I might talk a little bit about the way that we've approached leadership development, because I think when Pamela first mentioned to me, thinking about how you are partnered with the learner or the participant on this journey, right? I think there's no place that is more true than within leadership development, because of course no one can make you become a leader. We can give you a little name tag that says you're a manager, but leadership is an aspiration and a choice for those of you who like Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, right? And so helping folks make a mental shift, we call it sometimes for our early in career folks, from me to we, that is a process that happens within the human being, and we can't want it for them, right? And so I think we have structured a lot of our work in this space, whether it's with a frontline person who's new to a T-Mobile store who aspires to be an associate manager, or a very tenured senior manager who wants to be an executive, right? We think about giving them tools, resources. These are typically micro-learning curriculums that they can work through with either a sponsor or their immediate manager. And there's a lot of opportunity to select the things that you are going to go out and do, to practice, to apply, so that it really is a dialogue and an ongoing conversation between you and the person who is coaching you. And it is not a one-way, we are going to talk you in a classroom for 4 days and you're going to emerge a leader, whatever that might mean. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for folks to learn along the way and to skin their knees. And thinking of one of the programs that we run that has a social learning component. So I heard a few folks talk about how are you using social media. So we're a very big company. We use a lot of social media. We have an internal social tool. A lot of you all probably do. We use it for the reflection in our early in career leadership development programs. And so they will go into a practice of some sort. There's really one very funny one where they're working on tone in communication. So this is basic, right? They are learning about modulating their tone. They record themselves on their mobile devices because, of course, every 25-year-old has one. And they practice saying something 2 or 3 different ways. They have to listen to it. They have to share it with other people, get feedback. And then they go out onto the social learning platform and they answer some questions and they chat with each other about what this experience was like. And we can go out and read their postings, and they are amazing and sometimes humorous and really insightful. The way that you can see them helping each other, and also just reflecting on how this skill is really something that they can take with them into their personal life, and they can go back and practice with their children. I have, no joke, seen numerous postings that have said, I now understand why my children don't listen to me. That's a thing. It's just really interesting to see the self-reflection that has to be part of the leader's journey. And so I think, yeah, we always do this in partnership with the folks who aspire to lead.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was just thinking, when we were talking about the self-reflection part, that even though the practice of prior learning assessment is not new in higher education, we've been assessing adults' learning for, 40 years? I mean, SNL was one of the first ones. But we've been assessing learning that comes from the workplace for decades. But we rarely, at least in most institutions, not this one, but in most, we rarely look at the self-reflection that really goes on when somebody's trying to capture what they know based on what they did. Like what they experience is very different, but what their work was, what they did day to day, is so different than what they actually know and how that relates to everything else in their lives. And so I was just thinking about how much the process of self-reflection leads to the growth mindset. If you can say, I now know this, this means that I can learn at any point in my life. I actually can learn. And so many of the workers and learners that CAEL has worked with have not been leaders and managers. They've been frontline individuals who've never before been told that they had skills and competence. And so to think that there's a process of, in the end, yes, getting academic credit for it, but the process of figuring out what you know and can do can move you to a growth mindset. I was just sort of struck by that.
Thanks. And one of the things that you shared early on, Pam, was this sort of light bulb, at least for me, light bulb idea that as we move toward an increasingly automated workplace is when these liberal learning skills become even more important. And I wonder if we could think a little bit more. We grapple with in higher ed a bit, and one of the reasons I thought each of you would be such a great contributor to the conversation is sometimes I think corporate learning gets a bad rap for being just a commodified, it's just to get people to do this purely for the profit benefit, not for the human being. And one of the things that I've seen, I know for certain that I've seen both Tiffany and Melissa in their corporate settings bring the full human. I mean, you're not, well, yes, you have business results and that you're accountable to. The full human being is part of the picture, and I see that very much in both of your work. So I wonder if anyone wants to either speak to how either can we speak to each other across sectors to cross-pollinate, but what more ways can we be sure that we're not simply commodifying so that, I remember a colleague when she was finishing her doctorate said, she had all of these people saying, so what are you going to do with your degree? And she finally said, it's not a shovel. She just got mad at answering the question, but the idea that, that learning isn't a commodity, it's not necessarily a tool or a widget to do something in every setting, and yet in business we sometimes think, you're going through this program so you can do this, which is partly true, but it's also a bigger picture if we're in a humanistic society and we really want to create these cultures where people want to stay and contribute and become not just a growth mindset, but whole human beings.
Yeah, I love this notion of whole person learning. And for me, I think I've been talking to my leadership and a lot of folks around. We have to get people to think and get to know that learning is not an event. You don't go someplace to learn. Learning is a part of the flow of work. It's a part of the fabric of your being, whether you're in management or not. And so how can we remove learning out of traditional settings? And we've done research, and our people are telling us that we don't want to come to a classroom and sit in the classroom, right? So that Like, oh my God, how could that be? Because that's what we do, right? We're all happy to sit here and opine, and I'm the doctor, and you're the student, that's my life. But actually, our learners are saying, we actually want to learn on demand. Give us a small bites. Let us figure out how to get what we actually want when we want it. So, micro learning. People are asking us, we want to learn from our peers. We recognize you have experts, but we actually want to get together with other folks and learn from our peers. And we know we can't travel everywhere, so make it virtual, right? So it's this whole idea around getting people to think of learning as the natural way when they work. So for instance, in performance conversations, when you're coaching someone, one of the primary questions that we are asking people to consider is, what have you learned? If you had a chance to do it all over again, what would you do differently? All these questions are focused on learning, so learning becomes part of the natural conversation. And we're always looking for learning. When we ask for, receive, and give feedback, it's all in service of learning. So how do we do that? So when I think about your questions around the whole person, because we're not only thinking about a skill set. I think historically we've over-indexed on skill sets in our field. What are the skills you need? Now we're saying actually what are the mindsets you actually need, and what are the habits you need to be doing to be a full person, to be a full leader, a full human being. So your mindset, so thinking about your thinking. So how are you thinking about your thinking as it relates to that? How curious are you? What questions are you asking? Are you challenging assumptions, right? And then the behaviors, what are the things you need to be doing every single day, your whole life? Not just at work, not just in school, your whole life to be a better human, to be a better citizen, right? To contribute to the world. And I think those kinds of conversations are ways to cross over from higher learning to corporate to even K through 12. So I think that conversation needs to happen where we can actually teach people how to learn, as you talked about, Melissa, and also get them to understand that learning is not an event. It's our responsibility to learn. We're always learning, and to constantly be in a state of wonderment, of thriving, of asking questions. You talked about resilience. This whole idea around all this change that's happening with VUCA and all the disruptions. Is how do we get people to reimagine themselves, reimagine a new opportunity for themselves? That's a real skill, real learning around, okay, this is happening, and I don't have much control around it, but given what it is, what could I do? Right, so that reimagining, that's to me a different skill, and that's about, and you can use that for any aspect of your life. So it's not just learning for work, it's learning for every aspect of your life, being resilient in life, if you will.
I wonder, it feels like, Sybil, there's such interesting synchronicity around some of the work you're doing in community-based learning. Am I making it up that you've talked about it as interest-based learning? I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that, because it seems like in terms of preparing learners to move into this kind of environment, we're getting closer to it there. And then we want to open it up to, I'm getting a little greedy here, so I want to open it up to the rest of you to ask some questions and build on this conversation. But Sybil, if you can respond to that, and then we'll bring everybody else in.
Sure. Since 2013, I've been leading a citywide initiative out of the mayor's office called Chicago City of Learning, which is really focused on getting young people connected to interest-based learning opportunities in the out-of-school space. What I'll say about that work is some of what we were talking about here happens in that space. A lot of educators in the out-of-school space who are working with our young people are former formal educators who are working in the K-12 space and kind of sought refuge and see this space as a space where they can educate the whole child or the whole person. So as we've been talking about it, I've been thinking about that space. I've also been thinking about how what we're talking about is how learning is identity work. Who am I? Who can I be? And so for us who are working with young people, this is super important. We want our young people to have many possible futures and many possible identities, right? And see that there are lots of possibilities for where they could go. And so, so for us, that's a critical piece of that learning is helping young people awaken to this idea of who they are, right, through that reflection. And some of that happens sometimes more naturally in these informal spaces where young people are working. These are multi-generational spaces, so they're working with across age. These are spaces that are very peer connected, so the learning is often in the open, and people are learning together. These are iterative spaces where people are trying things out and maybe quote unquote failing, but then coming back. I can't tell you how many times I've heard mentors in these spaces talk about the persistence of their young people in terms of hanging in there and seeing things through. So these are spaces where sometimes it feels like there's more freedom to focus on the process over the product, and the process over the event, which in school the event may be a test that I'm about to take, and now that learning is over. It's done, right? I did it, and there's no more of that. And so in this informal space with young people, we've been really trying to work with those educators to make these processes more transparent and visible to their young people, because in these spaces, young people don't think they're learning, right? Because these are their informal spaces. This is where they go by choice. And so the task for us has been to try to help articulate what they are learning. And we've talked about that in terms of skills and knowledge, but also in terms of dispositions, which is the other connection I was making to what you're saying, kind of the habits of work in mind, and really making those visible to young people so that they can articulate that, but also so that they can value those habits of work in mind.
Excellent. Oh, good. Be here all night. So what is getting your attention here, Renee? Let me.
I was taking notes here. I have really three things I want to ask about really quickly. One is, no matter what the venue or where you are, we know corporate, educational, nonprofit, whatever, they love data. So how do you measure the effectiveness, one, and then two, return on investment, right? So is there a need? Do you find that you must do that still? Is that still a requirement? And then lastly, I'm curious about what tools do you see in the market now to take learning a step further? So like authoring tools or e-learning, or is it still a mix of GoToMeeting or WebEx and combining instructor-led with all types of creative things to get people to engage?
Did you have anyone in mind, or
no,
you're throwing it out to
everybody?
Did you want me to bring up? You had a couple of slides that we.
Oh, so yes. Well, this will be interesting because I think we're going to have some different answers here, at least from the corporate perspective. And I do have a really cool tool that we can show you a picture of. But
tell me where.
Oh well. Okay. So let's start with measurement. T-Mobile is not a hugely data-driven company, right? So there are plenty of other organizations in the Seattle area that are. Amazon would be one of them. So we do measure. We have KPIs that we report on. We also do a lot to attempt to measure learning, right? So like a Kirkpatrick level 2. With our HIPO programs, we look at the manager's reported improvement or readiness for the next level on the part of the participant. We also look at improvements in aggregate 360 scores in some programs to chart the progress of a cohort. Nobody really wants to look at this data but us. We find it fascinating. So one of the things that we've started to do, and we did the first one as it relates to agility shift, is we did a success case, and now I'm going to butcher this poor professor's name, Rob Brinkerhoff?
I think that's right.
Brinkerhoff, yes, okay, Brinkerhoff fans out there. We did a full success case. I've done several in my career. It really is a great way to contextualize the results of your learning endeavor for executives who pay the bills for the service but don't really understand what they've consumed. And so that, I think, if you have not looked at doing a success case, it's a really good way to tell a story about the impact that your learning is having on your organization. And in fact, with the one that we did, and there might be an example or two, I can show some at the end too. It's a qualitative and quantitative approach, and so they do survey data. This is part of the survey. There was survey data up there. 99% of people said that they had learned something, and 78% said that they had produced a tangible business result. And so as part of that process, they go back and then they interview people. What tangible business result did you produce? And so the case had 5 examples, and the savings in some cases were really remarkable. I mean, this one was an acceleration of free cash flow. Super exciting topic, but very meaningful at T-Mobile to accelerate free cash flow. Some folks reported savings of $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 from simple changes they had made from going through the agility shift. So, and yet, to go to your second question about ROI, so I'm super interested to hear what you say about this. We do not do ROI studies. I think it is a fool's errand to attempt to produce an actual ROI study that somehow justifies what you're doing. And I know there are folks who have to do them, but I think I've done them. I think you end up, it's like, smoke and mirrors and estimates, and how do you really attribute? So this to me is a much more like transparent and authentic way to report results. And then I think the tools question might be a second topic, so maybe I'll hand this off to someone else who wants to talk about measurement, and we can come back to tools.
Okay, so I'll just be quick.
No, that's all right. Go
All
ahead.
right, I'll just say, I work for an insurance company. We measure everything all the time, to the point it drives me nuts. So we measure everything from employee engagement monthly. In our learning programs, we clearly do the Kirkpatrick level 1, level 2s. Clearly in the level 2s, we actually do text finding. So if you can imagine, we bring in digital parts of our learning program, so we actually have people do competitions in class and take notes. We actually mine the text to see what they can recall. So that's an innovative way of measuring content. Before each of our leadership sessions, we send out 3 surveys to the managers of the individuals and the employees of the individuals about the content they're learning, the incumbent is learning in the program. So to test pre and post. So maybe, I think it's 180 days post-program. We ask the same people the same questions again to see if there was any movement. So we get level 3, if you will. I haven't seen an authentic ROI yet. We measure employee opinion surveys to no end. We measure culture surveys. We do diversity and inclusion surveys. We interview and survey to no end. There's a dashboard every month around measurement for me. It is the bane of my existence right now. So I think we over-measure.
Sam, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that over the last, I'd say, 20 years plus, I've worked personally with about 200 companies, some small, some large. And this question of ROI has been at the forefront of every CEO's concern in almost every company I've ever worked with. And everyone recognizes that you really have a hard time measuring true impact of learning and development or learning, development, and credentialing. However, everyone also knows that there are many factors that have to be taken into account. So, for example, one thing that I really learned a lot from myself was when there was still a Scott Paper Company. Scott Paper Company decided that the way they would measure the impact of one of our CAEL's programs was to calculate what would be the cost of doing nothing.
Risk of ignorance. That's the new form
Right.
for ROI.
To say, and in this case, just a quick example, they were trying to enable about 1,000 workers in the timberlands of Scott Paper. The guys that cut the trees down and ship them down the river to the mill, these guys. And they were trying to say, if we don't educate these 1,000 guys, what will be the cost to us. And we were able to calculate the cost of doing nothing. And when we presented that to senior management, it really opened some eyes to why this learning and development initiative made sense. So one approach that I've taken ever since is, what's the cost of doing nothing? Another one was, take anything you measure right now as a company. Maybe you measure patient satisfaction if you're a healthcare, or you measure a customer satisfaction if you're a customer care operation. Take anything that you measure and measure it at the beginning of the program, that this new learning development, whatever it is you're doing, and then measure a year in, measure 2 years in. And yes, of course, people will say, well, it wasn't just this that changed the outcome. Maybe other things had an effect too. But what you can say, as if you're a learning and development person, is, no, but this accounts for a proportion, a percentage of the total change in the right direction. And so ROI doesn't have to be, you have to measure, and it's only this one thing that made the difference. Just recognize maybe it's one of 6 factors, but it's one of 6. And so that is also something that I have seen really make a difference to senior management, because we come back and we present these results 1 year in, 2 years in, etc. And I have seen companies make investments based on this information. So I think there are indirect ways of getting at ROI that will be listened to, especially if it's done by an outside entity that has some degree of credibility in the eyes of the firm.
We have probably room for maybe one more topic. Trish, you want to introduce it or respond to this, and we'll start to find our way home.
Yeah, so this is my field, is artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and the learning function. We're actually the home here in Chicago. Dave Basarab actually introduced predictive evaluation in Motorola University in 1991. So there's actually a book called Predictive Evaluation, and it's based off of qualitative statements. So Tiffany, what you were talking about of being able to mine that information about the activity that you're doing, qualitative actually feedback from our level 1 evaluation forms, our smile sheets and training sheets, we can actually use that for predictive evaluation on who most likely will or won't actually transfer what they learn back onto the job, and be able to use that as leading indicators to get ahead of. That's been the nature of my work for many years now. And actually the first project that I worked on in applying that was on resilience, developing personal resilience in the UK. The second thing on that is there's a whole bunch of books by Gene Peace. His last name is P-E-A-S-E. They're published under Wiley. We didn't call it analytics back then, we called it optimization. So if you look up Gene's books on optimization, because we can actually now do both formative assessment and ROI real time. And the data is based off of not only our learning and training data, but also off of our operational data. But it has to do with what we have access to because of the tools that we now have in our environment.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that we've seen both in a competence-based program at School for New Learning, but also in workplace competence that you've had some interesting conversations around is, and I think this is the blessing and the curse of assessment when we have predetermined outcomes that we're assessing against, that sometimes we can miss some really cool, impactful things that are happening. And I think that this is why the success case method has some really interesting possibilities, because it both is quantitative and qualitative, but the qualitative interviews that are followed up from the data are asking for examples that aren't with predetermined outcomes, so we can discover, oh, we weren't necessarily thinking about the cash flow thing that isn't even in my wheelhouse, that you found that, that was like, we weren't planning that wasn't designed into agility shift, or we heard things like people's, solved something and retained a high value employee, or other things that weren't designed in, but when we can creative ways to do the assessment, that can account for the surprising ways, so that we're not limiting learning by assessing against predetermined outcomes, but we're in fact expanding and having some important surprises.
Yeah, Rob Brinkerhoff actually came out of retirement to actually work on there's a platform called Promote out of Europe that can be used in order to help facilitate transfer and so on and so forth. Success case method is awesome. It's fabulous. Big fan over here. But the last thing, too, in what you're talking about with the intangible benefits and things that we haven't even thought of with outcomes, is that that's another thing that we can use the AI tools for, is that we can actually process our data and analyze our data through AI in a way that tells us which factors mattered most and what other outcomes we may have not been aiming for, but found out that we've now hit, but didn't know because it's got a different way of being able to look at the information that it's processing.
Excellent, thank you. So, I don't know about you, but one of the things I'm loving about the conversation is that it's been we have not been talking in boxes. We've been talking very iteratively, and I want to, as we close out, give whoever would like to sort of weigh in, or maybe each of you make a closing comment or statement that, not that we can end the conversation, but we'll be moving into some informal networking outside in just a moment, but do you want to try to wrap up what is standing out for each of you as we close the conversation? And
you just put me on the spot. What's standing out for me, I think I would say, is the idea of this whole person learning. I think that's standing out for me. It is around how do we start the conversations and get people to not bifurcate sort of their lives at work or at school and at work or at home, and think about the whole person and what's essential for their entire life, their whole being, and how can they get whatever they want and desire to manifest at work or at home and school all the same, and not try to bifurcate them. And I think a lot of our education, even in our education in our corporate endeavors, have done. So how can we create more whole person learning versus this bifurcation?
ah, nice.
So I'll just leave with the question.
Ah, I love it.
Excellent, and I know in the back, I think I promised someone some information on innovative new tools. I have two, they're very cool if you want to check at the end. One is called, well anyway, it has an avatar run by an actor, super cool stuff. But that is not the thing I want to close with. What I want to close with is just thinking about what we as learning and development or HR professionals, the change that we have had to make in how we think about and approach our work, right? And I feel this acutely sometimes because I lead a fairly large team. Many of them were HR program managers, and so not learning developers. Some of them were facilitators, many of them were instructional designers or web-based training developers, right? And we are asking them all to work very differently, because to produce the kind of learning outcomes that we're talking about, right, they have to approach the work differently. And so, when we go to create a new experience, it is iterative, and we do pilot, sometimes 10 times, sometimes 12 times. We did a case study where we made no less than 30 changes to individual characters within this case. And at one point, the program manager called me and said, I had exhausted the team's interest in iterating. This is an exact quote. And I said, but we're not done yet. You're not done. So I think it is, we are asking people to think about their work differently, to approach their work differently, and sometimes we just have to give them a little grace and patience to get there, and a pat on the back when it's going well, and a glass of wine when you've done your 10th iteration. So that'll be my thing I'll leave you with. Thank you.
I think I'm leaving with excitement around how these ideas that we're talking about here that are kind of lodged in this work-based space, whether that work is happening in corporate, nonprofit, or higher ed, how those ideas, and if we elevated this conversation, might really impact the K-12 space. Because as I said at the beginning, we talk very abstractly about this world that our young people are moving into. But I think if we were to elevate this conversation and connect this conversation more, it wouldn't be so abstract. You know, I'd never heard of VUCA before, before I was getting ready for today. And if in the K-12 space, we had ways to talk concretely about what this world is, even if it was just to talk about VUCA, I think that might create a different sense of urgency around doing some of the things that we talk about but are really hard to implement in the environment where learning is taking place right now in K-12.
There's just one thing that I'm struck with, and that is that it just seems to me to be a real privilege to be working on human potential. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a lawyer recently, and he said to me, you know, the reason you have such an optimistic view about life is because you work with people at their best, when they're learning, when they're growing, when they're trying to think about their future. He said, I work with people at their worst, when they're in conflict. And he said, you know, you are lucky to be working in the world of human potential. So I was just thinking how lucky I am to be a part of this conversation. It's a privilege to do this work. That's what I'm struck by.
What a wonderful message. I'm so grateful for all of you for coming and spending the time and being in this conversation. Of course, there's a million things pulling us in various ways, and when we actually come together and are in the room together and having these conversations, really interesting connections happen, and I hope you'll continue to think about these and connect.